All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into a book that really captivated me, and it's called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot.
A fascinating story.
It really is. We've all heard of HeLa cells.
Right.
For anyone who's not familiar, these are cells that have been used in labs all over the world
Right.
for countless scientific breakthroughs.
Like exactly.
And we're going to learn about the woman behind these cells,
Yeah.
Henrietta Lacks, and the ethical quagmire, I think, surrounding their origin.
Yeah, it really is a story about scientific discovery, but also the ethical considerations, medical ethics, and impact on people's lives and all of that.
It's a fascinating story about how these cells have had such an impact. I mean, polio vaccine, cancer research, gene mapping.
Okay.
I mean, they're everywhere, but for so long.
Right.
Henrietta Lacks' name was not really known. So Skloot starts by really, I think, beautifully sort of setting the scene of Henrietta's
life.
Yeah.
A world away from,
yes,
these sterile labs.
She was born in 1920 in rural Virginia, one of 10 children, so a big family. And they were a tobacco farming family, so really tied to the land. And that makes the contrast with the scientific impact of her cells even more striking.
It's a huge contrast, isn't it? Going from tobacco fields to, being almost a part of the fabric of modern medicine.
Absolutely.
And then Skloot goes on to trace her move to Turner Station, which was a community just outside of Baltimore.
Baltimore, yes.
With a very large Black working class population.
Yes.
And it was there in 1951 that she was diagnosed with cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins.
And this is where things start to get a little bit complicated because at the time, racial disparities in healthcare were very entrenched.
Yeah.
And Johns Hopkins, while being a very prestigious hospital, also served a large portion of Baltimore's poor.
And a lot of Black people went there for their healthcare.
Okay, so during her treatment, doctors took a sample of cells from Henrietta's tumor.
Yes.
Without her knowledge or consent.
This was standard practice at the time.
Yeah.
But these cells turned out to be unlike anything that anyone had ever seen.
Yeah.
So these cells
became HeLa.
Exactly. These cells became known as HeLa, and they had this incredible ability to reproduce outside of the body indefinitely.
Wow.
Which had been something that scientists have been trying to do for years.
Yeah.
And a scientist at Hopkins named George Gay, who had been working tirelessly trying to grow human cells in the lab, he finally had his breakthrough.
So it's almost like the sort of movie, everyone's trying to figure this out, and then boom, these cells come along, and they just keep growing and growing.
That's exactly it.
What happened next?
So HeLa cells really took the scientific world by storm. They could be grown very easily.
Shipped around the world.
Okay.
Used in all sorts of research and organizations like the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis.
Wow.
Which was desperate to find a polio vaccine.
Right.
They really played a big part in making HeLa very widely available.
So as HeLa is becoming this kind of, scientific sensation, what's happening with Henrietta's family?
So her family remained completely in the dark.
Oh, wow.
For decades, they had no idea that these cells taken from their wife and mother were fueling all of these medical breakthroughs. It wasn't until the 1970s that they even learned about HeLa.
Wow.
And as you can imagine, the news was met with shock and anger.
I can only imagine finding out that something that's a part of your loved one, taken without consent, has become, this worldwide phenomenon.
This really gets to the heart of the ethical issues surrounding HeLa.
Yes.
And it's important to remember that this was a time when, the legacy of the Tuskegee syphilis studies
was very fresh in people's minds.
Yeah.
Which was just a horrific example of medical abuse targeting Black men. And it happened around the same time as HeLa's origin.
Oh, wow.
So, this really fed into the distrust that the Lacks family felt towards medical institutions.
And it wasn't just about the lack of consent. It was about,
It was about the commodification of Henrietta cells,
They were being bought and sold, used in all these experiments, generating, who knows how much scientific and commercial value, and her family's, struggling to make ends meet. And this is where the story of Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, becomes so central, I think, to this book, because she really takes on this quest to understand her mother's story.
Yes, she becomes obsessed with learning about her mother, a woman she never knew, and unraveling the science behind these incredible cells.
So she's both trying to understand her mother and trying to understand, the ethical complexities of how this
Exactly. She's grappling with a lot, trying to figure out, how could this happen?
Yeah.
How could my mother's cells be used all over the world without our knowledge?
And, her journey, I think, is a really powerful exploration of grief.
Yes.
Of scientific curiosity and the enduring questions about, ownership and consent when it comes to our own bodies.
Yeah, it really does make you think, about the responsibility of science. But before we go too far down that road, I'm really curious about how these cells became immortal in the first place. What made them so different?
That's a great question. And that was really the million-dollar question for scientists.
Right.
I mean, they knew that, in a lab setting, most cells would eventually die off after a certain number of divisions.
Okay.
But HeLa just kept going. So remind me of how cells normally reproduce. I vaguely remember something from high school biology about mitosis.
Mitosis, exactly.
Yeah.
So mitosis is essentially cell division.
Okay.
You can think of it as this carefully choreographed dance.
Right.
To make sure that when a cell divides, each new cell gets a perfect copy of the DNA.
Okay, so what went wrong with Henrietta's cells? I mean, was this just a random error in the dance?
So it's more complicated than just a random error.
Okay.
HeLa cells were infected with a particularly aggressive type of human papillomavirus, HPV-18.
Okay.
And this virus played a key role in transforming her normal cells into cancerous ones.
So the virus hijacked the cell's replication process.
Exactly. And so this, combined with other genetic factors, resulted in not only cancerous cells, but cells that could divide indefinitely.
So it's almost like this perfect storm of events.
Right, a perfect storm.
That led to their immortality.
Right.
It's almost cruel, isn't it, that these cells that were born from this tragic disease
become the key to fighting so many others.
It really highlights that kind of complex relationship between disease and scientific advancement.
Yeah, but there's another layer to the story. And that is this problem of HeLa contamination.
Yes.
HeLa cells. I remember reading about this. They were so good at growing that they started taking over other cell cultures.
That's right.
In labs.
So this actually became a major issue.
Wow.
In the 1960s, a geneticist named Stanley Gartler.
Okay.
He kind of dropped a bombshell on the scientific community.
Okay.
His research showed that numerous cell lines that were thought to be from different tissues were actually all HeLa.
So all of these experiments, all this research was contaminated.
Potentially contaminated, or at least, there's a lot of questions raised about the validity of these studies.
That must have sent shockwaves through the...
It really did.
Scientific world.
Yeah.
Years of research. Yeah. Millions of dollars, potentially.
Wasted.
Yeah.
And I think this contamination problem is actually directly linked to how Henrietta's family finally found out about HeLa.
Yeah. So in the early 1970s, researchers needed to figure out how to identify and contain this HeLa contamination. And to do that, they needed to study the genes.
Right.
And to study the genes, they needed blood samples from Henrietta's family.
So decades after taking her cells without consent, they show up and they're like, hey, we need something else from you.
Yeah, we need your blood.
That must have been so jarring.
It was a complete intrusion into their lives.
Right.
I mean, they were still dealing with the loss of Henrietta, and now they had this shocking revelation to contend with.
Your mother's cells are...
Your mother's cells are alive?
Yeah.
And they're all over the world.
And this is really where Deborah's story, I think, becomes central to the book.
Yeah.
She's trying to make sense of her mother's legacy.
Yeah.
And, this scientific phenomenon that came from her own flesh and blood.
And her thirst for knowledge is so palpable in the book. She really wanted to understand the science behind HeLa.
Right.
She wanted to grasp, how these microscopic cells from her mother had become so significant.
Right.
But it wasn't just about the science. It was about reclaiming her mother's story.
Wow.
For her family.
It must have been such a whirlwind of emotions.
Yeah.
Pride in her mother's contribution.
Right.
But anger and confusion about how it was handled.
Absolutely.
Does Skloot capture that complexity?
Yes, Skloot really does a beautiful job of portraying Deborah's journey, her frustration with the lack of information, her distrust of the medical community, but also her genuine desire to learn, to understand.
Yeah, I remember that scene in the book where she finally sees HeLa cells under a microscope.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I must have been.
It was a pivotal moment.
So powerful, both awe-inspiring and heartbreaking. It
was a tangible connection to her mother.
Right.
I mean, she even says in the book, that's my mother. She's a celebrity. But that feeling is quickly followed by, a harsh reality of how those cells were taken.
It's such a perfect illustration of this ethical tightrope walk that this whole story embodies.
Absolutely.
It makes you think about, the price of progress. And it wasn't just about Henrietta.
Right.
Skloot talks about some other cases that were happening around this time that really bring up these same issues about consent and ownership.
Yeah, like the John Moore lawsuit, for example.
Yeah.
Where a doctor patented cells from his patient's spleen without consent. And that fueled this already heated debate about whether we have any property rights over our own tissues.
So it's almost like Henrietta's story magnified on a legal scale. These aren't just scientific questions or ethical questions anymore. They're becoming legal battles.
They are.
And those legal battles, while separate from Henrietta's story, I think really resonated with the Lacks family's fight for recognition and control over Henrietta's legacy.
Right. They wanted acknowledgement.
Right.
They wanted their mother's contributions to science
to be recognized.
And respected.
Yeah, and it brings us to this, I think, really critical point.
Yes.
Despite the immense scientific and commercial value of HeLa, Henrietta's family received
no financial compensation.
That's no financial compensation.
That's right.
So it really raises this question of fairness.
Yeah.
Who benefits from scientific advancement? Who bears the cost?
It's a complex issue.
Yeah.
For sure.
With, I don't think, any easy answers.
No easy answers.
But it's important to remember that HeLa cells are still being used in research today. I mean, they're leading to advancements in cancer research, genetics, countless other fields. So HeLa's impact is undeniable. I mean, trillions of HeLa cells are estimated to exist in labs worldwide.
Right.
They're continuing to contribute to these medical breakthroughs.
Yeah.
But Henrietta's story, I think, serves as this constant reminder about these ethical considerations that have to accompany scientific progress.
Yeah.
I mean, it really makes you wonder what Henrietta would have thought about all this,
Yeah.
Her cells are this scientific marvel, but her family's left to deal with the consequences. And Skloot doesn't shy away from portraying their struggles, does she?
Not at all. Poverty.
Yeah.
Limited access to education.
Yeah.
The systemic racism of that era.
Right.
These are all woven into the fabric of this story.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that, scientific advancements don't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
They're deeply intertwined with the social and economic realities of the people involved.
And yet, amidst those hardships, there's this clear sense of resilience, particularly in Deborah. I mean, despite the trauma of losing her mother and then discovering the truth about HeLa, she never gives up on this quest for knowledge.
No, she's amazing. She even went back to school.
Wow.
Determined to better understand the science behind HeLa.
Wow. So she dropped out of school at a young age and then went back. To try to understand that.
Yeah, driven by this desire to know her mother better.
It's really inspiring. Yeah. I mean, it shows that even in the face of such injustice, there's this enduring human spirit, this thirst for knowledge and understanding.
Yeah.
Did she eventually find some peace?
I think she did.
With the situation.
Yeah. I mean, through her interactions with Skloot and various scientists, Deborah came to appreciate the good that HeLa cells had done for the world. She saw how they were being used to fight diseases, to unlock the secrets of human biology.
So she found a way to kind of reconcile the scientific progress
with the personal
cost.
But I think she ultimately embraced that complex legacy.
Yeah. And one of the most touching moments in the book, I thought, was when Deborah, along with her brother, finally gets to visit a lab and see HeLa cells under a microscope.
Yeah. I mean, she was overwhelmed with emotion.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah, she saw the beauty and the power of these tiny cells, realizing that they were a part of her mother living on in this extraordinary way.
But Skloot's book doesn't end with this tidy conclusion, does it?
No.
It feels like the story's still being written.
It does, yeah. Deborah passed away in 2009. But Henrietta's story and the ethical questions it raises are more relevant than ever.
Yeah.
I mean, HeLa cells are still being used in research today, driving new discoveries, pushing the boundaries of medicine.
So what does this all mean?
Right.
What are we supposed to take away from this deep dive into the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks?
It's a story that forces us, I think, to confront the complexities of scientific progress, the ethical gray areas, and the importance of respecting individual rights, even in the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, Henrietta's story has ignited all these crucial conversations.
Yes, it has.
About informed consent, tissue ownership, and the equitable sharing of benefits from scientific research.
Yeah.
I think it's just a stark reminder that we can't just celebrate the achievements of science without acknowledging the human stories behind them.
I think that's Skloot's greatest accomplishment.
Yeah.
She humanized science.
Yeah.
You know, she showed us that behind every scientific breakthrough, there are real people, real families whose lives are impacted in really profound ways.
Yeah, it's a story that stays with you.
It does.
It really makes you think about the world differently. And I keep coming back to this question of, if Henrietta Lacks were alive today in this era of, you know, genetic testing and personalized medicine, would her story be different?
That's a good question.
Would she have had more control? I think it's a question worth pondering.
It is.
As we continue to navigate this, you know, ever-evolving landscape of science and ethics.
Absolutely. And while we can't change the past, we can learn from it. And make sure that future scientific advancements are guided by respect, transparency, and a deep appreciation for the individuals whose contributions make it all possible.
That's a great place to end it.
Yeah.